Okay, so on January the 9th, I handed out lesson number 9, and so we are continuing our study entitled, What on Earth is God Doing? And so we are getting an overview of God's plan for the ages, and so we are looking at the various dispensations in human history and in the future, dispensations in which God is seeking to glorify himself through the responsibilities and revelation that he gives to mankind. So we've talked about various different dispensations, the age of innocence, the age of conscience, then human government, and then the previous one to this was the age of promise for given to Abraham and his immediate descendants until the giving of the Mosaic law on Mount Sinai to the nation of Israel. So now we have been, since January the 9th, looking at this dispensation, the dispensation of law. And so we talked about the extent, what period it covers. So it covers from the giving of the law on Mount Sinai to the day of Pentecost, which is recorded for us in Acts chapter 2, which began the church age. And so it extends up until that period of time. And so as I mentioned before, that is a little confusing for us then, because we look at the Gospels and we think they're in the New Testament, therefore they must be New Testament documents, but they are actually recording the end of the dispensation of law, and a lot of the teachings in the Gospels are given in preparation for the church age. We talked about the characteristics of the law. That it is a governing document for the theocratic kingdom of God on the earth. That is the nation of Israel. It was their constitution. We talked about the new revelation as well as the responsibilities, the failures, and the judgments. And on page 5 and following, we talked about the fact that this Mosaic law was a conditional covenant, that is, that God made a contract with the nation of Israel. God promised to do something if the nation would do something. So if the nation would follow God's law, then God would continue to bless that nation and make it a nation of priests for his glory. And one of the key features was that they were to keep all of the law, all of the time, with the right heart motives. All right? And those three things are key, because even when you talk to people today and you talk about whether they obey God, a lot of people don't like to admit that they're sinners, and they say that they love God and they follow God's laws. But God is looking for complete obedience, not just obedience when it's convenient for us. All right, and so on page 8, I introduced this question to you last week, but I did not start it. And so the question on page 8 in the middle is, are we still under the Old Testament law? Now, remember, the Old Testament law is one indivisible unit. We saw from the book of James that to break one law is to break the entire law. All right? And so we have to ask and answer this question: are we still under the Old Testament law? What are we not asking here? We are not asking if there are continuing principles in the Old Testament that we are responsible for today. Right? Because there are some moral issues that are brought up in the Old Testament that we are still responsible for. We're still responsible to love God with all of our hearts, right? And that was in the Mosaic covenant, but it didn't start in the Mosaic covenant, even though it was explicitly stated in the Mosaic covenant. Likewise, there are a lot of moral issues such as lying, cheating, theft, etc., that are addressed in the Mosaic covenant, but that doesn't mean that they all of a sudden became sins in the Mosaic covenant. They were always sins because they are an extension of, those commands are an extension of God's holy character. He expects us to be holy, and therefore we should not lie, steal, etc. All right? So we're not asking if there aren't moral obligations that we are under today. All right? We're asking the question whether we are under that Old Testament law that God had given to the nation of Israel. All right? Does that make sense? All right. And so let me clarify one other thing here so that we are clear. There are some people who think that we must keep God's commandments in order to be saved from our sin and hell. And so when I ask the question, are we under the Old Testament law, they're thinking in their mind, do we still need to keep God's commands in order to be saved? The answer is, no, we don't need to keep God's laws in order to be saved, because we never can keep God's laws in order to be saved. How are we saved? We are saved by God's grace. God's grace is his favor that he shows to us. It's unmerited favor. It's not favor that we can earn by doing good things. Right? That's what Ephesians 2:8 and 9 says. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is, let me continue those verses here. It says, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. Salvation is a gift that he gives. It's not something we can earn by keeping a certain amount of commands. Again, those people that believe they can be saved by keeping God's commands simply are saying, I think that I am fairly good because I sometimes keep God's commands, and therefore I think God should be kind to me and not necessarily to someone else. That's essentially what they're saying when they say that we can be saved by our sins. Because, again, James said, if we're guilty of breaking one of God's laws, we're guilty of all of them. All right? So we can't earn our salvation through our good works. And that is why Ephesians 2:8 says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. That last phrase is an important distinction. If we say we can be saved by keeping God's commandments, then we're not relying upon God's grace at all. We're relying upon our relative goodness. But that's why Romans 3:10 and 23 says, what it says is important. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. It doesn't matter whether we think we're relatively good. When we compare ourselves to God, we are not perfect. And the requirement for heaven is perfection. Moral perfection. And so Romans 3:23 says that we have fallen short of the glory of God, and it is because of the fact that we all fall short of the glory of God that we will not make it to heaven. So it's not a case of, am I better than you, or are you better than someone else? It's a case of, how do we compare to God? And the answer is, we don't meet his high and holy standards, and therefore Romans 6:23 says the wages of sin is death. We all deserve hell because of the fact that we are sinners. We might not be a sinner to the same degree as someone else, but we are still a sinner in the sight of God, and that's why we need his grace. Because we can't earn his favor through our good works. We can never match his holiness in our lives. And so we're not asking about the issue of salvation here, right? We've already talked about the issue of salvation on page 7. The basis of salvation in every age is the death of Christ. He needed to die on the cross to pay for our sins. The requirement of salvation in every age is faith. And the object of faith in every age is God. The content of faith changes in every dispensation. We didn't put anything there about obeying God's commandments because we can't earn our salvation by keeping God's commands. All right? So it's a different issue that we're answering today. We're trying to ask a question. Are we supposed to keep the law that God gave to the nation of Israel? All right? And so on page 8, I said the answer is no. But I don't want to just stop right there. I want to give you the reasons why. And believe it or not, the next few pages are just a summary of how we can answer this question. But I want to answer it thoroughly enough that you are convinced of it. All right? The answer is no. Let me show you the reasons why we are not supposed to. God does not expect us to keep the Old Testament law. First of all, number one, the nature and the purpose of the law. What is the nature? What is the purpose of the law? And so we saw last week, the information above shows that the law was given to a specific people. Who were those people? Israel, Jews, living within a certain geographic area, which was the land of Canaan, or the land of promise, whatever you want to call it. But they were living in a certain land. And all of the Mosaic law, to some degree, has the requirement of living in the land, right? Isn't that what God said? If you don't keep this law, I'll take you out of the land. It was tied to the land. And notice as well, for a very specific purpose, to glorify God. To glorify God. And so blessings were promised to those who walked in obedience to the law. Not salvation, but blessings. God promised to bless that nation if they would just follow his law. But curses were pronounced on those who would not live in accordance to the law. So, in other words, when we look at it in that light, God is addressing a certain people, Israelites. He wasn't addressing the church. Furthermore, this law was an indivisible governing document. Indivisible. You can't break it up and say, oh, well, I kept this law, and this law. They had to keep the entire law. And it was intended for corporate adherence. Not only was it meant for the individual Israelite, it was meant for the entire nation. They needed to obey it as a nation. And it could only be obeyed within the land. Why do I say that? Well, even the festivals, for instance, they were tied to the harvest of the land, and then they had to bring their harvest in as an offering to God. Then there were certain feasts that had to be observed specifically in the city of Jerusalem. They couldn't be observed anywhere else, such as Passover. And so Jews all around the world still celebrate Passover, they think. But they were supposed to follow it, observe it in Jerusalem. All right? And so people can get spiritual and think that they are obeying God's law by observing the Passover wherever they might be, but if they're not following God's command that says to observe it in Jerusalem, they're not following it at all, because it's an indivisible unit. You can't pick and choose what you want to follow. All right? So, the nature and purpose of the law tells us that we are not under the law. Explicit texts tell us that we are not under the law. We have many texts that tell us that the New Testament Christian is not under the Old Testament law. I've listed for you many in the brackets there. The one that I want to show you specifically is Romans 6:14, and it says, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." And so I've mentioned this before. What Paul is saying there is he is not saying that we are not under rules or obligations or commands. Christians have rules, obligations, and commands, but this is you are not under the law. The Mosaic law. We are under grace. All right? And so let's continue on. The second reason why we know we are not under the Old Testament law is that when we examine the characteristics and the requirements of the Old Testament, we must conclude that we are not required to live under its code of conduct because of the impossibility of being obedient to it. Let me pause right there. I introduced this section by saying, let's use some logic, or let's use some deduction. Let's reason together. You know, when you talk to people about issues like this, and you want to have a discussion with them, there are barriers in their thinking. And if you would say, are we under the law? All of a sudden, some people will get very upset and insecure that you would even ask the question. And so they respond on an emotional level and put up their guard and say, yes, we're under the law, but let's reason about this. And they're not able to reason. They're not able to use logic because they are insecure in where it may lead them. And so all we're doing now is taking some information and we're saying, let's look at this information. Let's walk through it together. How do we take this information and how do we reconcile it? All right. And so I said it's the impossibility to obey it, first of all. I do not mean that it is impossible to keep the law because we are sinners, though that is true. We cannot keep the Mosaic law because we're sinners. And what are sinners? Sinners are hostile to God. And we have a very nature within us that says, rebel. Whether it's against God, whether it's against our parents, whether it's against our other authorities, our government, we want to rebel. That's our nature. And so that's not what I'm talking about here when I say it's impossible to keep God's law. It is impossible in ourselves to keep the law, but I'm talking about a different impossibility. I mean that it is impossible to keep the law because the same conditions and circumstances no longer exist. And we already talked about the conditions and the circumstances, right? God said, if you keep the law, I will bless you. And the circumstances, we're not in the land of promise. We're not in the land of Canaan. We can't go to Jerusalem to keep the feasts. We can't go to Jerusalem to slay an animal to worship God. Right? That's part of the Mosaic law, the animal sacrifices. So the conditions and the circumstances have changed. And if they've changed, that means we're no longer required to keep the Mosaic law. So let me summarize here. It is impossible to keep the law as it was originally intended. That is, using a literal interpretation, which is what we want to do. If we interpret Scripture literally, we will have to admit that we cannot keep the law because of its nature, its purposes, and because of the conditions, circumstances that we are living in. Because obedience to a literal interpretation is impossible. We only have two options. Since a literal interpretation is impossible, we only have two options. One, we can continue to interpret it on a literal fashion and agree with the verses which state we're not under the Old Testament legal system. Or, number two, we can revert to spiritualizing and allegorizing the text in order to make it fit our day. All right? And we certainly don't want to do the latter. We want to make sure that we are interpreting the Bible as it was meant to be interpreted on a literal fashion. Since the first approach is the one that I've been encouraging as the correct method of studying the Bible, let's briefly analyze some aspects of the law in order to demonstrate that we are not under the law and that it is impossible for us to be so. Okay, and so let's talk about the land promise. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down the Mosaic law in a very summarized fashion. And we're going to look at some of the features of the law and demonstrate that it can't apply to us. And if it can't apply to us, then we're not obligated to keep it. All right? So the land promise, Deuteronomy 4:40 says, "You shall therefore keep his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land." What land? The land which the Lord your God is giving you. Okay, I don't live in that land. You don't live in that land. And we can't say, well, God has given us Canada. No. He's talking to some people here. He's talking to Israelites. He gave them the land of Canaan. All right? So we can't change the meaning of the verses to fit our situation. God gave a distinct people specific promises, which were inseparably linked to the promised land. Those promises were an inheritance, a dwelling, fertility, safety. And therefore, if the land is not on offer, if God is not offering us the promised land with all its attendant blessings through obedience, then the Old Testament law is not in force. Right? There was a God's side, their side. And so if the land is no longer on offer, then obviously God is not saying to me or to you, you shall keep the Mosaic law today. There's no possible way that we could interpret the Bible literally and come up with a conclusion that God is going to bless our land if we are faithful to God. That is spiritualizing the text, and it is not being faithful to a literal interpretation of the Scriptures. And this is because there's no such thing as a distinctly Christian nation or a distinctly Christian land. There's no such thing. Promises such as those above can only be given to a body of people living collectively within the same region, which can't be said about Christians who live throughout the world surrounded by unbelievers. Okay? Different situation completely. All right? And so therefore the law does not apply to us. Because of the very nature of the promises, it is impossible to make direct application to believers today. Let's continue on. Let's talk about some of the worship laws that God gave in the Old Testament that clearly indicate that we are not under the Mosaic law. Contained within the law were very specific worship laws. The nation of Israel was commanded to worship in a central location where God had placed his name. That started out with the tabernacle in the wilderness. Later on, it became the temple after Solomon built it. So when the tabernacle was standing, the nation of Israel was expected to travel to the tabernacle to worship God. When the temple was erected, the nation was expected to go to the temple to worship God. All right? Do either of those exist today? Can we go to a tabernacle? No. It's not in existence, is it? Can we go to the temple? No, we can't. Because the temple isn't even in existence. It was destroyed in AD 70. There is no temple. And in fact, on the site of the temple right now is a Muslim mosque preventing Israel from even trying to erect a temple so that they could worship God. Talk about a problem for them, not for God. All right, so when they worshiped God, they were to bring the appropriate sacrifices. They were given specific guidelines to follow for those sacrifices. And so when we look at the Old Testament law, again, people want to say, yes, we're under the Old Testament law. Well, let's look at Leviticus 1 to 7 then. Chapters 1 to 7 detail these sacrifices, the various sacrifices, whether burnt or grain or peace or sin or trespass offerings. Are you bringing all those offerings to God? Most of these sacrifices involve the slaying of an animal, the shedding of blood, the sprinkling of blood around a central altar. An altar had to be used. So, in other words, you can't take your lamb that you might have today and take it into the backyard and slay it and say you're worshiping God because you don't have an altar. All right, and so oftentimes that carcass had to be burned upon the altar. All right, so a lot of things had to be followed according to God's way, and we can't simply say we're still under the law, but we don't have to follow all those nitty-gritty details. God said you need to follow the nitty-gritty details to the nation of Israel. And so, in addition to the sacrifices, there were also feasts to be observed. There was the Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, or also called the Feast of Weeks, then the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of the Atonement, and of the Tabernacles. And I said more specifically, male worshipers were required to attend 3 of these feasts in Jerusalem every year, regardless of where they lived. So unleavened bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Tabernacles, regardless of where they lived. So if they lived in the northern reaches of Israel, of the country, and one of those 3 feasts were coming up, they had to leave and walk or take a donkey usually and go all the way to Jerusalem specifically to observe those feasts. And so on page 11, a central worship location, animal sacrifices, annual feasts, some of which were specifically held in Jerusalem, show that the church is not under the law. And as I mentioned, no one is under the law because they can't keep those requirements. Furthermore, this demonstrates that even contemporary Jews in Israel or in New York or in Vancouver are not under the law because they cannot obey God's commands literally. They have no temple, they have no altar on which to offer sacrifices. They can't offer sacrifices, they have no temple, etc. And so worship in our dispensation is no longer centralized. That's what Jesus said in John chapter 4 and verse 21. He said, as he was speaking to the woman of Samaria, listen very carefully to the verse that Jesus said. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father." He was talking about the establishment of the church. They were worshiping in Jerusalem. That was the correct place, but Jesus predicted a time when that would no longer be the case. All right, and so sacrifices, we know, are no longer necessary according to Hebrews chapter 9 and 10, and feasts are no longer relevant, Colossians chapter 2. So if those things are not, if God is not obligating us to those things, if they have been eliminated, the sacrifices and the feasts, then we're obviously not under the Old Testament law, because the Old Testament law was one indivisible unit. Let's talk about Sabbath laws. This is a fun one because there are even some Christians today who believe they are following God's Sabbath laws. All right? And hopefully I can convince you that that is not the case. The paragraph just above day of the week, the word Sabbath is a derivative of a word that means to cease or to rest. So that's where we get the word from, or that's where I should say the Hebrew language got the word Sabbath from. It came from a word that meant rest, and so it was derived from that word, and so that helps us to understand a bit about the history. But now let's talk about why it was initially instituted, the day of the week. Sometimes in Scripture, the word Sabbath refers to a particular day of the week. Which day was that? Elizabeth says Saturday. What number of the week was that? The seventh day, Saturday, right? We start our week on Sunday, and so Sunday is the first day of the week. Saturday was the end, the seventh day. And so when Sabbath was used in the Old Testament, it referred to Saturday. All right? So while the term Sabbath often refers to a particular day of the week, many do not realize that it refers to Saturday. And the reason is there's been a lot of confusion in Christian circles because there have been Christians in the past that have referred to Sunday as the Sabbath. All right? But it's not the Sabbath. The Sabbath is Saturday. All right? And so Christians have done a disservice by calling the Sunday Sabbath. All right? And so it is the seventh day, which was a commemoration of the seventh day of creation when God ceased from his creative activity. So he didn't stop all activity. God is always working. But he ceased his creative activity. So in Genesis we see that it says on the seventh day God rested from his creative activity. And that is the reason why God instituted the Sabbath as the nation of Israel's day of rest. Saturday, furthermore, to complicate things, Saturday began at sundown Friday night and continued to sundown Saturday night. So there might be some people that say, well, yeah, I observe the Sabbath. In fact, there are some Christians that are really staunchly Sabbatarians. They worship on Saturday. But if they were going to be literal, they'd have to start at sundown on Friday. And in the wintertime, when does that start? That starts about, 4:30? 5 o'clock? I'm not sure exactly, but somewhere around there. So 4:30 Friday night begins Sabbath. And yet, I don't think many people who say they really observe the Sabbath day start Friday night. All right? And so, again, it becomes something that we want to follow, but we're not really careful about following it the way God has intended it to be followed. So the Sabbath was to be a day of inactivity. This means that God expected Israelites to cease from activities beginning at sundown on Friday night. No work was to be done during that time. This prohibition included the starting of fires, the gathering of wood, the preparing of meals, and marketing, that is buying or selling. So you couldn't even start a fire. You couldn't even prepare a meal. So you had to cease from activity. So the Sabbath was also a day set aside for corporate worship, and I've given you some biblical citations for that. So those who insist that they are observing a Christian Sabbath are playing fast and loose with the scriptures, because they usually do not follow all of the Sabbath laws which were originally given. Saturday, starting at Friday night at sundown, no activity. Most people think that the Sabbath refers only to a particular day of the week, yet Scripture mentions other Sabbaths or rests which were just as binding. What, there are other Sabbaths in the Bible? Oh yes. Oh yes. Let's talk about certain feasts. The Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were celebrated together. The Passover fell on the 14th of Nisan. Let me know. I see you're still writing there, so obviously I'm going a little quickly, so I'll try to slow down a bit. So Passover fell on the 14th of Nisan. That was the first month of their year. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread began on the 15th of Nisan and extended to the 21st of Nisan. The first and last days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread were Sabbath days. Add to this fact that during those 8 days, at least one natural Sabbath or Saturday would occur, and that day might not coincide with the first or last day of the feast I think that should say first Saturday, last day of the feast. Saturday might not be one of those 3 Sabbaths mentioned above, and they might celebrate 3 Sabbaths in the space of 8 days. Okay? That's confusing. And partly it is the way I've written it there, I admit. But in the space, the Passover was a Sabbath. The day after the Passover was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was actually 7 days in length. And the first day of that feast was a Sabbath. The last day was a Sabbath. All right, so you've got 1, 2, and 3 Sabbaths within the space of 8 days. But then, depending on how those days fell, there might have been a literal Saturday in between that Feast of Unleavened Bread. So there might have been 4 Sabbaths in a space of 8 days. Do you understand that? All right, so those people who say they follow the Sabbaths aren't really that careful, are they? Because there are certain feasts that were Sabbath days as well. The Feast of Weeks occurred 50 days after the Sabbath of the Passover, so 49 days after the Feast of First Fruits, and they were to count 7 Sabbaths, that is 49 days, and on the 50th day, they were to celebrate the Feast of Weeks. Thus, there were 2 Sabbaths in a row, the 49th and the 50th day. Okay, so the Feast of Weeks, 50 days after the Passover. So they would count 7 days Sabbath, 7 days Sabbath, 7 days Sabbath. And they'd get to the 49th, Sabbath. But then a 50th day would be a Sabbath as well. Then there was the Feast of Trumpets. It was held on the first day of the 7th month, and it was likewise a Sabbath, though it might not have been the weekly Sabbath, that is the Saturday. So there's another Sabbath that they needed to follow. Then there was the Day of Atonement. It occurred on the 10th day of the 7th month, and it was also a Sabbath day, along with the Feast of Trumpets. There could potentially be 2 extra Sabbaths in the 7th month. Then the Feast of Tabernacles. It lasted for 7 days. and the first and the last of which were both Sabbaths. With the addition of these 2 Sabbaths, there was the potential of having 4 extra Sabbaths in the 7th month, in addition to the weekly Sabbaths. I don't expect you to process all this, because it's overwhelming, and that's the point. All right. And then lastly, the Feast of New Moon. It does not appear to be it does not appear to be legislated as a Sabbath, but seems to have become a Sabbath through custom. If it was a legislated Sabbath, Israel would have had another Sabbath every month almost when the new moon appeared. So that one's speculative. All right. So, wow, there were other Sabbaths other than the 7th day of the week. Is that it? Oh, no. Oh, no. Then there were certain years that were Sabbaths. On page 13, the 7th year was a Sabbath. The entire year was a Sabbath. That meant that every 7th year, it was a Sabbath for the land. The people were allowed to plant crops for 6 years, but on the 7th year, they were to leave the land alone and allow the poor people to glean any fruit that might grow in that year. So if you are a farmer and you had land, you might have sectioned it off into 7 pieces so that you could rotate it. But every 7 years, one particular portion of that land you couldn't do anything with. That would have been hard, because that would have been loss of income, right? That's how you would have thought in your mind, I could really use that crop. But God said, I need to leave it. But there was a blessing attached to it, and that is that God would make that land more fertile so that they would make it up. So by faith they needed to follow God and leave it alone. They didn't. We know that that was one of the reasons why they were taken into captivity, because they did not follow the Sabbath laws. Okay, let's talk about the next certain year that was a Sabbath. That was the 50th year. That was the year, Jubilee year, which occurred every 50th year. And it was also a year of rest for the land. So no planting was to be observed in the 50th year. Add this information with the 7th year Sabbath mentioned above. Every 7th year was a Sabbath rest for the land. Thus the 49th and the 50th year were both Sabbath years in which the land was allowed to rest. All right, so think about it with me in this way. You could rotate your crops in such a way, or section your land so that you had different sections and there was only one section having a Sabbath every 7 years. But not so on the 50th year. On the 50th year, all of your land had to remain, what's the word I'm looking for? No, I can't remember what the term is. Anyway, they could not plow the land, they could not work the land on the 50th at all. All right? And so it's overwhelming to realize how many Sabbaths were commanded in the Old Testament. For a person to simply decide to observe a weekly Sabbath, Saturday, would not have been sufficient. God would not have been satisfied with that. He would not have said, okay, well, you followed the Sabbath, the Saturday. You didn't follow any of the other ones. That's okay, though. No, he wanted them to follow all of the Sabbath laws. God commanded all Sabbaths to be observed, and those who claim that Christians are still under the Old Testament law and therefore obligated to keep the Sabbath day, Saturday, they need to be consistent. And if we're under the Sabbath law, we're under the Sabbath's law. We have to keep them all. Who's in for that? Put your hand up. It doesn't sound ideal, does it? All right, we will stop right there. We'll talk about the blessings and the curses to come.